Hi, everyone. On behalf of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. AAAS is the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific society with experts in more than 90 countries, and is a leading publisher of cutting-edge research through its science family of journals. My name is Steve Newell, and I'm a project director at AAAS's Center for Scientific Evidence and Public Issues, also known as the EPI Center. At the EPI Center, our mission is to make it easier for policymakers and other decision makers to access relevant scientific information and integrate that evidence into their decision-making process. Since April of 2019, we've been working on election security, primarily focusing on three areas: how people vote, post-election audits, and the future of voting. Working alongside scientists, nonprofits, election officials, and security experts, the Epicenter has translated and disseminated information on election security to more than 1,000 election officials across the country in letters, op-eds, briefings, reports, and direct meetings. In this work, we've also been lucky enough to benefit from the expertise and insight of the nationally recognized experts joining us today. The 2020 elections drew record turnout with over 158 million Americans casting a ballot. Despite concerns regarding COVID-19 and foreign interference, election officials, federal agencies, national organizations, nonprofits, and vendors described the election as the most secure in American history. In partnership with the National Academies, we held a briefing in December covering what we learned from that election. Since then, we witnessed the horrific attack on our nation's capital by people citing election misinformation on January 6th. Just this year, we've seen more than 1,000 election security bills introduced across the country, with hundreds of these bills making ballot access more restrictive. During our conversation today, our goal is to provide evidence and insight to help understand the challenges our elections face moving forward. Today, we will cover misinformation and trust in elections, ballot access, voting administration, cybersecurity, audits, and ongoing election security needs. We'll cover these issues through an expert discussion panel that will last about 45 minutes before moving to about 20 minutes of Q&A. I would encourage you to begin sending in your questions now using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your window, so we can jump right in and get to as many questions as possible then. So with that, let me turn things over to Anne-Marie Mazza, Senior Director of the Committee on Science, Technology, and Law at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, to tell you a little more about their election security work and introduce our esteemed moderator before we move on to the panel discussion. Anne-Marie, all yours.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for the opportunity to partner with AAAS on today's webinar. Good afternoon. I am Anne-Marie Mazza, Senior Director of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on Science, Technology, and Law. It is my pleasure to join with Steve and AAAS in welcoming all of you to today's webinar. In the fall of 2018, under the leadership of University Presidents Lee Bollinger and Michael McRobbie, an expert consensus committee of the National Academies comprised of computer scientists, election officials, and legal scholars issued a report reflecting the committee's year-and-a-half-long study of the U.S. election system. The report, Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy, offered numerous recommendations for improving the nation's election system, such as states should mandate risk-limiting audits prior to the certification of election results. Internet voting should not be used at the present time and not be used in the future until and unless very robust guarantees of secrecy, security, and verifiability are developed and in place. Election administrators should routinely assess the integrity of voter registration databases and put in place systems that detect efforts to probe, tamper with, or interfere with voter registration systems. And election systems should continue to be considered as U.S. Department of Homeland Security designated critical infrastructure. As most of you are aware, there are heated debates taking place both at the state and federal level regarding restrictive and expansive measures for voting. As noted by the Brennan Center as of late March of this year, legislatures in 47 states have introduced more than 300 bills with restrictive provisions. While some of these bills have both restrictive and expansive effects, most of the provisions of these bills are considered restrictive. At the federal level, a debate is heating up over voting rights legislations, with disagreements over such things as early voting, voting ID, and mail-in voting. In considering all of this legislation and in thinking about today's panelists and the topics they will be discussing, I am reminded of something that co-chairs Bollinger and McRobbie wrote in the preface of the Academy's 2018 report, that I believe is even more relevant today. They wrote, and I quote, "Citizens must become more discerning consumers of information, and state and local governments must work collaboratively and together with the federal government to secure our election systems. Our leaders must speak candidly and apolitically about threats to our election systems. Transparent communication about threats to the integrity of our elections is vital. Openness is the most effective antidote to cynicism and distrust. We must be cognizant of deliberate and deceitful efforts to spread disinformation and propaganda. The American people must have confidence that their leaders place the larger interests of democracy above all else. The future of voting is one in which a clear tension must be managed. We must prevent bad actors from corrupting our electoral process while delivering the means to provide suffrage to an electorate that is growing in size and complexity." With that, I'm especially pleased to introduce President Michael McRobbie, who will be moderating today's discussion. President McRobbie is the 18th president of Indiana University, one of the largest universities in the United States. He holds faculty appointments in computer science, philosophy, cognitive science, informatics, and computer technology. And he has been an active researcher in information technology and logic during his career. President McRobbie serves on numerous boards, committees, and organizations. He has received numerous awards and honors and is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. President McRobbie.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Maza. I'd like to particularly welcome all those who have joined us for this very timely discussion on election security, which is a follow-up to a similar discussion that we held last December, and which today will focus on the future of election security and how we can build on the lessons learned from the 2020 general election. I also want to thank the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Center for Scientific Evidence and Public Issues and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on Science, Technology, and Law for their support as well of today's event. The 2020 general election was fraught with challenges, perhaps to a greater degree than any election ever before in US history. Even before the onset of the COVID-19 global pandemic, the resulting economic uncertainty and crisis, and the renewed and urgent demands for racial justice, serious concerns were being discussed surrounding issues that include voter suppression, ballot access, foreign interference in our elections, the spread of misinformation, and election security, all in an atmosphere of highly divisive political discourse. The National Academies Committee on the Future of Voting, of course, considered these and many other issues during our 18 months of deliberation. And we are joined today by a panel of four distinguished election security experts. And following our discussion, Drs. Newell and Maza will ask questions of the panelists that have been submitted by our viewers. So each of our panelists has many, many impressive career accomplishments. But in the interest of time, I will introduce each of them only very briefly this afternoon. Duncan Buell is the NCR Chair Emeritus in Computer Science and Engineering at the University of South Carolina. His most recent work focuses on electronic voting systems and on digital humanities. He has been part of a team that is auditing election data in South Carolina and discovering problems in the process that led to uncounted votes and to the absence of data to support the vote totals certified by the state. He is a member of the Election Verification Network, which is a group of interdisciplinary voting experts from around the country, a member of the League of Women Voters of South Carolina, and serves on the Richland County Board of Voter Registration and Election in South Carolina. Richard King is Associate Professor and Director of the Master of Public Administration program at Auburn University. Her research focuses on political participation, voter disenfranchisement, citizen perceptions of the electoral system, and voting administration during the COVID-19 pandemic. And she has support from the National Science Foundation, the Oak Ridge Associated Universities, and the MIT Election Data and Sciences Lab. She regularly engages the election administration practitioner community through her work in the Election Center Certified Elections Registration Administrator, which is known as the SARA program, and public talks sponsored by the Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, and Pantheon Analytics, among others. Previously, she worked as a voting rights researcher in the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. Amber McReynolds is the CEO for the National Vote at Home Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to making sure that every American can vote in secure, safe, accessible, and equitable elections by expanding vote at home systems in all 50 states. She is an expert on election administration and policy and co-author of the book When Women Vote. Currently, she serves on the National Election Task Force on Election Crises as an advisory board member for the MIT Election and Data Sciences Lab, a board member for Lift Colorado, a board member for Represent Women, and serves on various advisory boards for other national organizations focused on improving election administration. She was recently nominated by President Biden to serve on the U.S. Postal Service's governing board. And prior to her current position, she was the Director of Elections for Denver, Colorado. And our final panelist is Maggie Toulouse Oliver, who serves as the New Mexico Secretary of State. Since becoming Secretary of State in 2016, she has implemented increased transparency rules for financial disclosure and campaign financing reporting, modernized the online campaign finance system, helped craft and pass good government legislation like same-day voter registration, automated voter registration, and the state's newly formed Ethics Commission. In addition to her elected position, Secretary Toulouse Oliver is the president of the National Associations of Secretaries of State and has previously served in other leadership roles in that organization. She's a member of New Mexico's Complete Count Commission for the 2020 census and is currently a W.K. Kellogg Foundation Community Leadership Network Fellow. So that's just a little about our four very distinguished panelists, and our thanks to all of them for being with us today. So I've got 6 questions to get our discussion started, and those questions also have a number of sub-questions in them. So I'm going to start with my first question, which is about the issue of the spread of misinformation. And this, of course, was a major concern in the last election, particularly given there were at the same time so many changes to standard election practices as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the questions are that I'd like to ask: what did we see in terms of misinformation for the 2020 election, and how has that affected in particular, how has that affected the current policy conversation around election security? And then secondly, what are the major drivers of misinformation and distrust on the issues concerning election security, and how can these factors be addressed? And then finally, there has, of course, been no evidence of widespread election fraud in 2020 or, in fact, any other American election. And despite this, voter fraud continues to be one of the main topics of conversation in election security. So what additional steps can policymakers be taking to try to increase even more the trust in election and try to decrease the distrust that has arisen about alleged voter fraud? So I think, just in the interest of getting the discussion going, maybe we can start alphabetically and then work our way around and then just open it up at that point. So let me start first with Duncan. Would you like to respond to some or all of those questions, Duncan?
Yes, I think part of the problem with the misinformation is that the laws regarding voting are very different from one state to another. So when the voters were hearing things on the national news, it was almost certainly something that didn't apply to them because they were in a different state. And with something as important as voting, that kind of confusion makes it easier to misinterpret things or think there's something going on. And I think in fixing it, the most important thing is transparency and honesty. Elections are complicated things. They're not going to be perfect, but I think most election officials get it 99.9% right. And one shouldn't jump to the conclusion that just because one precinct opened late, the whole place just collapsed. I mean, it's not like that. It's going to be chaos because it's a distributed event run by people who don't do it every day. That's not going to be perfect.
Bridgett.
Yeah, I would pretty much just sort of echo what Duncan said. I think, part of the problem with the 2020 election, one being that there were rapid changes that states and local jurisdictions were making in order to ensure that voters could vote safely in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And even with that, there were points and times where it was like actually confusing with respect to what the rules were, particularly if someone did not want to vote in person and wanted to submit an absentee ballot. So one of the issues obviously was the great variation in rules across jurisdictions in adjustment to sort of COVID-19, but also just if we think about elections in general, right? It is each state has very specific policies and practices and procedures. And unless you're someone who is constantly attuned to what those changes are when an election comes around, what you did in the previous election might not be the rule in the current election. And so in many ways, COVID-19 and a lot of the rapid changes that occurred, coupled with sort of the national news coverage, heightened confusion that would have existed perhaps at a lesser level in sort of the general cycle of elections that we've become accustomed to. In terms of solutions, I think one of the best solutions is to listen to the actual experts. And I would think election administration is one of the very specific areas. Well, there's probably many actually, but one of the areas where the practitioners are the people who actually have the expertise and understand the rules, policies, and procedures, and not necessarily the politicians themselves.
Emma.
Well, thank you for that great question. Disinformation and misinformation, I think, is our greatest election security challenge, actually. It has been for a while. And what we saw this year was that it flourished. And Duncan's exactly right that inconsistent policies and procedures create an environment for that disinformation to flourish in a very big way and create confusion. And also, similarly, people move across state boundaries. And when you experience one thing in one state and you go to another state and it's completely different, especially voter registration deadlines and all those sorts of things, it can disenfranchise and leave people out of the process and create doubt. So in terms of solutions, I think that we do need more national standards around the voting process in every state. That's not to say that somehow the federal government's going to take over elections, but that is to say that voters, we should have more standards. And there's been multiple examples, bipartisan ways, where the federal government has weighed in on policies around elections. NVRA was a good example, and now we have 50 different ways of NVRA being implemented. But at least creating some baseline provisions that can be standardized across the country, I think, would be a big part of that. And then I think the other piece of this and why disinformation flourishes so much in the election world is that local election officials, this has been looked at very closely by a lot of researchers. 95% of them have 5 or fewer full-time staff in their office, and that contingent of 5 full-time staff is usually not a technologist and not a communications person. So when we look at the resources that exist in local election offices, who, by the way, are also the most trusted source of information for voters by far, but that they score way above everybody else, and so do local reporters, we find that they often lack the resources within their offices to respond to these issues and to talk to the public and and often are constricted by technology in a lot of ways. So I think for solutions, we have to continue to build on that infrastructure and make sure that local election offices and state offices have the resources that they legitimately need to do their jobs and do so in a nonpartisan way, and then continue to build resiliency in the election process. So offering more days, more options, more time to build that trust, because we also have to remember that voters are the customers of our democracy. They are trying to access a service that the government is supposed to be providing for them in a nonpartisan, efficient, reliable way. And so whatever we can do to continue to build that resiliency so that voters have options, they can trust the process, they can see the process, they can experience a transparent procedure, and all of those things will ultimately help solve, or at least move towards solutions that will hopefully decrease the disinformation spread as we saw in the 2020 cycle and as we're still seeing even today.
Madam Secretary, your thoughts?
Thank you. I was thinking as you asked the question, so 2020 was the 4th presidential election that I've either run directly on the ground as a county clerk in my former position or overseen at the state level. I have some of you may have heard this before, but I have a loving phrase that I apply to every presidential election, and I say it's the circus coming to town. The circus comes to town every presidential election, and that means a lot of fun, but also a lot of chaos, some suspension of disbelief, clowns, bears, right? All the things. And so we always knew going into 2020 that it was going to be a really epic circus. And of course that did bear out, and it bore out in some really tragic ways, as we are all well aware of. I would like to point to a couple things that I think we did really well this election cycle that we need to build on for the future to help combat mis and disinformation. And by the way, I just want to say that I completely agree with and echo everything that my colleagues on this panel have already said. One is that, in my experience, we started talking about what is election night going to look like? When will the results come in? How will they come in? When do you begin processing your absentee ballots? When I say we, I mean secretaries of state, election officials across the country. I started doing interviews and talking with national and local media about those things well in advance of the election this year in a way that I had never done before. And that suggested to me, the media were really working to help try to educate the public about how this election process actually works. What can voters expect? What is it going to look like? Really trying to prime the environment for folks to have that information already baked in so they weren't sort of wondering what was happening, right? In the intensity of election night. I think that was really helpful. Of course, it didn't go as far, as it obviously needed to, right? Or we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I think we need to do more of that. And that's a really critical piece of public education around the election process. The other thing, I'll point to an example that we did at NAS, the National Association of Secretaries of State. We started a campaign called Trusted Info 2020. All of us, our colleagues around the country, as well as many of our local election official colleagues, really tried to amplify the message that for voters or just interested citizens that were seeing election information out there, that they needed to go to their trusted source of information, as Amber said, their local or state election officials, to go straight to the horse's mouth to get that accurate information. Those are two, I think, really great examples of things that were done well, but that need to be built upon and expanded in the future to help really deal with what is, clearly, I think everyone on this panel would agree, and hopefully those of you out there listening, the biggest challenge to our democracy and to election administration moving forward.
So let me take up what Amber said in particular. I just want to ask you another question that comes out of that. So I come from a country a long time ago that is a federal system as well, but has one single federal election commission for the whole country for federal elections, and consequently there is not only is there a baseline standard, there are the same standards in every state. But I remember we had that discussion about single election commissions versus a distributed state-based system where each state effectively makes its own rules by and large. And it was argued that that was also could be seen as a strength as well, because it removed one single point of vulnerability and provided multiple different systems, which meant that even if some were somehow compromised or got into difficulties, the others would be okay. And that's an interesting argument as well. But nevertheless, when you're up against adversaries, whether they be state-based, I mean, overseas state-based or otherwise, who have the resources to throw up against, I think, as one of you said, election officers with 5 employees, none of whom are in IT, it does make them rather vulnerable. So the argument for at least baseline standards seems to be a good one. But what are your thoughts about that tension between centralized but maybe making the whole system vulnerable versus distributed? And then if you agree to the idea of there being baseline standards, what do you think of the prospects of ever getting those? I know there are some, but what are the prospects of getting those sort of expanded upon based on the kind of experience we've had in the last couple of elections? I'll open it up to anybody who wants to respond.
Well, I would add, I think the folks that have articulated that the decentralized nature is about technology. So the systems and the things that the state manage, they didn't necessarily, in my view, articulate that having a completely decentralized policy structure where every deadline is different and every procedure is different and there's no standards from state to state. And the post office, for instance, can't even articulate when you need to have your vote by mail application in for it to be mailed on time, because it literally varies 50 different ways. So when people say that, I think that they're speaking more to the technology structures that support the election process, not necessarily policies that are really about the rules and procedures. So I would just differentiate those two, because I think that is a very different conversation. The one other thing I would add, and I've been saying this for a while, I do think that the United States needs to have a serious conversation about the governance of elections and what that looks like. So what at the federal level is the role? Many times this election season saw people from the FEC being asked questions about election administration on the cable network shows. And I was like, why are they being asked about that? Because they're involved in campaign finance. And then there's the EAC, which has, a limited role with what they're doing. So I think there's just a lot of confusion really that's been created because we haven't had a real conversation around governance. And then at the state level, it varies. There's elected secretaries, there's state board of elections, there's local electeds or appointed or hired. And when you look at some of the other modern democracies in the world, they have tried to pull election administration into more of a professional environment that's free from partisan politics. So more independent authorities, or they're separate from being in the elected partisan structure that we actually have throughout our system in the United States. So I really do think it's an important conversation to have, because I think it's something that we need to do some work on and improve on, because that's also how our system was attacked, because it became so partisan when it's really a process that should not be. The campaigns can be partisan, but the process of delivering the service of election should not be.
I agree with Amber, and I would just say that that is the key, is decoupling the politics from the administration of elections. And I believe very strongly that the vast majority of my colleagues at the state and local level, you can't separate a personal opinion from a human being, right? That's not possible. But when we walk into our office, we leave our partisan hat at the door. And I think we saw some really strong examples of that. We saw a very strong example of that in Georgia. We saw a strong example of that in Nevada. And then of course, the politics starts to get in the way. But I think, as Amber says, I think there's a case to be made. I'm both one of those people who will stand up and say that I believe strongly that the decentralization of elections does contribute significantly to election security. And I will also say, you know, as just myself, not in my president of NAS role, that we do need some federal standards. I think it's basically a fundamental equity question. You know, if I'm a voter living in New Mexico, I can request an absentee ballot anytime I want it. I can begin voting early 28 days before the election. I can register online. I can register at the same day at a polling location. And yet, you know, my cousin, friend, whoever, you know, a couple states over has none of those options, right, to vote in a federal election. And that seems like a fundamental voter equity issue that I do believe personally does need to be addressed at the federal level.
All right. Anybody else got anything else they want to add on this topic? Otherwise, we can move on. Okay, so let me move to ballot access. So broad and vote from home options clearly greatly expanded ease of access to the ballot in 2020. But nevertheless, the question remains, what else can be done? What are the remaining big challenges in addressing ballot access, firstly? And secondly, Black and Latino Americans and Americans with disabilities have traditionally faced greater barriers to voting. So what lessons and resulting policies from 2020 could help improve ballot access for traditionally marginalized and underserved communities moving forward? And then finally, there are, as we discussed before, there are numerous voting bills being considered and passed around the country. And many of these bills cover aspects of remote voting, early voting, and infrastructure such as drop-off boxes and so on. What do these bills get right and what do they get wrong? I mean, obviously there's been a lot of criticism of them, but what is it that they are getting right? How does this work to balance ballot access and security in these areas? So let me just open it up to whoever wants to take on those highly contentious topics too.
I'll go. That was a lot of questions. So, and I guess in many ways for me, that set of questions also connects to the question we were just discussing briefly, which indirectly effectively touches on federalism, right? So whenever we're having conversations about whether more centralized, if we sort of separate the election security part, right? And we're just talking about like access and policies and procedure, right? You know, one of the big questions with any discussion about a more federalist structure or a more centralized structure is like, well, who gets to make the decision about what the policies and rules actually are? And so one thing we know, some sort of looking at the history of voter access, disenfranchisement, et cetera, is that even when the federal government does step in to create a more equitable system, nefarious actors, particularly in state legislatures, find a way, right, to somehow create an outcome that best reflects their preferences. And so in spite of the things that we've learned, you know, from COVID-19 and how the use of expanded vote by mail options can facilitate turnout, access to drop boxes can facilitate people engaging and participating. I do think, you know, one persistent challenge for a lot of election officials is finding places and spaces where people can vote in person and ensuring that those places are accessible for individuals with disabilities, but also ensuring that they're accessible for the various diverse populations in the communities where they're positioned to serve. And in many jurisdictions, that can be a challenge, right? Because you can only place a polling location where there is a place to put one. And like, you know, many components of election administration, polling locations also are not free, right? So I think part of addressing some of those disparities, whether they be about race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or disability, is to some of the other points we've mentioned, providing election officials with the resources that they need to set up a system that does address the challenges for different populations across different jurisdictions in the United States.
Anybody else on ballot access? It's a topic on which one could say an enormous amount, but anybody else want to comment on ballot access?
Yeah, I'll just add in, so a couple of things. I think on the, a record number of people voted early and voted by mail for the first time ever. Way more people voted prior to election day than we've ever seen before. That trend of vote by mail has been growing for more than 2 decades. So this is the only part of the election method contingent that's been growing. And part of the reason for that is it is an accessible option for many people. In fact, MIT even looked at, and a few different people have looked at the accessibility community in particular, in the 3 states that have topped the list in terms of closing the gap in accessibility turnout are Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. And that was as of 2018. And I think we'll probably see something similar come out of 2020. And part of the reason for that is that many people that have accessibility challenges, transportation is the problem. And yet, when we go back to the Help America Vote Act, all of the money went into making in-person voting options accessible with equipment that wasn't what it needed to be and didn't meet security standards as it should have. And now we end up with states that have replaced all of that, which is a good thing because there were security flaws. But at the same time, we didn't address the fundamental accessibility challenge that so many voters had in 2000 and years prior, whereas some of these states have actually closed that gap. And it's because transportation is that big barrier that we often see with folks, especially in underserved communities. So I think we continue to expand on what we know works. And there's a lot of studies and data that is proven that early voting and vote by mail and even vote centers and some of the other concepts that have been developed over time and tried and innovated on continue to expand that access. The other thing that we know, and looking back at Florida 2000 and even prior, is election laws broadly, policies, procedures, all of this has not been designed with the voter first mentality. So pro-voter, how do you design a customer service process, work back from there, build the processes, build the procedures that put voters first, and then build a technology that supports the good process. We've kind of done this mishmash, and often it's legislators pass legislation, technologists say, well, we can't quite do it that way, so fit this, round square peg in a round hole. And then we end up with things that are kind of clunky and don't efficiently work that well. So I think, kind of thinking about it in a more systematic way to design a system that is fully accessible, secure, transparent, all those things that we want. They're not mutually exclusive. We need all those values to balance each other in the process to create systems that work for everyone. And finally, the thing that gets missed in all of these discussions, and I say this a lot, 1/3 of our electorate that were eligible to vote did not participate in the 2020 election cycle in the highest turnout ever. Almost 80 million people did not participate, and many of them indicate access, missing deadlines, weren't sure who to vote for, it was too complicated, whatever it was. And so to me, we should also be looking not just at who voted in this cycle, but who didn't vote and why, and how do we build better systems to serve them.
I could just add on to what Amber just said really briefly. I think that's all really right. And I just want to draw attention to this concept of developing systems that place the voter first, because some of the improvements that we've made to accessibility in New Mexico, particularly for our voters in our, our very rural tribal areas, for example, or for our blind voters, voters that have vision impairment. They have been, the processes we've created have been through working with those communities, working with leaders in those communities and folks that have the lived experience. We know that the technological advancements that we've made that create accessibility for most New Mexicans don't necessarily serve folks in rural tribal areas because there's still a massive digital divide, right? We wanted to create an online, the ability for a blind or visually impaired voter to be able to mark their ballot online, but not have to email it back. So how do we do that, right? And working with them to figure that out. So again, keeping the voter at the center as these systems are being designed to create accessibility for these communities is really important.
Duncan, you want to add anything?
I think Amber and Maggie have said it well, and Bridgett. So no, I don't have anything to add on this. This is not one of my strong points.
So the last part of the question, let me just sort of ask that again. I'm interested in your opinions as experts. The number, I think, is about 1,000 bills around the country and so on. And many of these have been criticized for actually reducing accessibility and so on. Many of the things that were open up and for the last election are being trimmed back and cut back and made harder and so on. But are there trends in some of the legislation where you think things are being got right? Are there innovations coming out of this of any of this legislation that that actually is going to have an impact, a positive impact on accessibility, at least in some parts of the country? Anybody seeing anything like that?
Well, let me jump in here. We're doing a lot of work in various states on this. There, you know, if you look at kind of the geographic distribution of the country, the Northeast has not had much no excuse absentee or early voting. In fact, New York had neither one of those options prior to 2020. And other Northeastern states have also been pretty constricted actually prior to Election Day, and they've mostly had Election Day voting. So many of them, I think, recognized in 2020 that they needed more resiliency within their election process, needed more options, especially in a global pandemic. And they learned from that. And now we're seeing a lot of expansions. Vermont has moved forward legislation to make permanent the changes they made. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, all of them are considering and moving forward legislation that makes some of those changes permanent. We're also seeing, and this is one of our top recommendations from my organization is ballot tracking systems, and 6 states as of 2020 had full systems with text and email notifications. Many states added to their functionality online to provide that data. That's certainly a growing phenomenon. The great thing about it is it doesn't require a law to change. So there's some of these administrative functions and steps that states are taking up. And I think a lot of that is lessons learned from 2020 and trying to improve on their customer service and some of their offerings. And Kentucky, of course, is another good example of a state that did pass a bipartisan reform, codified early voting. All of that is positive, you know, in terms of what is happening around the country. So I think there is very good examples of this, and in fact, more examples than bad examples of expansions.
Right. So let me move on to the third topic, which is voting administration. But the first question will sort of pick up pretty much exactly what you were talking about there, Amber. So there were, of course, a lot of vote by mail policies, legislation brought in before the last election, and so on. Are there any major modifications to vote by mail policies, though, that any vulnerabilities, any issues? I think you've pointed to one, ballot tracking, as an area worthy of being expanded, refined, built upon, etc. Other areas where there was experience gained and learned during the last election that could be usefully, productively turned into legislation, voting election legislation in states around the country.
Yes. So first, in terms of kind of what states are doing, we saw a big expansion of drop boxes. In fact, Secretary Toulouse Oliver expanded those greatly in New Mexico. There were many examples of that. New Jersey, a lot of Georgia, even a lot of states expanded this. And I think a lot of that was in part due to many people voting by mail, but still wanting the option to drop their ballot off in person. So I think that is going to be a continual phenomenon. And then I think the second big thing that I'll say, and I'll just, and I'm sure others have other ideas on this, is the coordination with the United States Postal Service. So a lot of controversy over the post office last summer. I have long felt that there are many opportunities for the Postal Service to better support the entire election kind of structure and all that goes into election administration. Vote by mail is a part of it, but frankly, there are way more letters that confirm voters' registrations, send them polling place information, send booklets about what's on the ballot. So much more election mail than even just vote by mail itself. So I really think there's an opportunity for there to be a lot more coordination, and there should be, with election officials, but also I think the Postal Service can do a better job of providing a suite of products that support election officials. And that includes intelligent mail barcode tracking and informed delivery and some of these other technologies. GIS, they have a whole giant GIS platform that largely goes underutilized. They also have a national change of address database that most states don't utilize automatically right now. So there's just I think there's a tremendous opportunity with some of the infrastructure that exists within the United States Postal Service. And I've been talking about that a lot lately.
In your new role in particular, I assume.
Well, if I'm confirmed, yes.
If I could step in and amplify some of this, from 2010 to 2018, Richland County, which is Columbia, state capital, University of South Carolina, had 5 to 15% of the votes done by mail. And we did have, I'm no longer in South Carolina, so I had to resign from the commission as of March. But we had 17 excuses. We didn't have no excuse absentee, but we had 17 excuses for in-person absentee. For 2020, that 5 to 15% went up to 40% of the ballots returned early. And one thing that does is make election day itself a lot easier to manage. You don't need to have the same resources. You don't need to have the same polling place locations with that much parking and everything. So the more you can accommodate even the same number of voters spread out over time, the easier it's going to be to make sure that people get to vote. We had in Richland County, we had only one drop-off box at county headquarters. I think we had 7 or maybe 8 total in-person absentee polling places, each of which had a drop box. And that made it a lot simpler. And they were spread geographically across the county. That kind of change, I think, is very, very good and needs to be continued.
A question about drop boxes. I mean, it seems to be just so self-evident that this is a good thing to assist people in encouraging people to vote and so on. And yet, I guess one was sort of stunned to see some of the criticism, unfounded, I believe, in certainly most, if not all, cases. But are there major additional things that could be done to really make them sort of beyond criticism, or at least extremely hard to criticize? Are there proposals for how to make them some system of very high security for drop boxes? Are there any initiatives like that underway anywhere in the country?
We're undergoing and Amber mentioned that we did an initial round of Dropbox allocations this last election cycle here in New Mexico, and we're getting ready to do phase 2 of that to permanently establish Dropboxes. Of course, many other states have done this to a much more significant degree than we have prior to this point. But, you know, as we're going through this process, we're taking great pains to ensure that there's security. Of course, what most people don't know is that ballot drop boxes are you know, sort of this highly engineered, you know, these tamper-proof systems that come with lots of bells and whistles to ensure that not only if they are tampered with, that, you know, the election officials are alerted to that. Sort of both low-tech and high-tech solutions. We're implementing all of those, and you know, again, what most people don't know is to the extent that drop boxes exist out there in the world already. They're already employing this kind of both low and high tech security system. I have a county clerk here in New Mexico who came up with a brilliant idea that we need to figure out if we can get mass produced, but she wants a scanner on the ballot drop box where you scan in your ballot and the drop box says, oh, I got, Maggie's ballot, check, and it lets the system know that it's been received, right? And that would be, so there are some other greater accountability mechanisms I'm sure we could build in, and I'm sure Amber is probably the repository of all such knowledge, but I'm throwing that one out to you, Amber, for future future reference.
Yeah, that's a good one. And that we had talked about this actually with the vendor that we used in Denver years ago. I was like, can you get a solar scanner on there so that we can, but yeah, there's some really great things that people are doing. And I would just say too that, the needs of a rural community with very little traffic is going to be very different than the needs of a more urban area, right? So I think that what we also need to consider in states is you don't want to make it so cost prohibitive that rural communities can't afford to put up certain types of cameras and things like that. One of the things that we modified actually our law in Colorado to do is to capture movement, because if you're just capturing a box that has no movement around it, you're taking up a lot of space in the server. So there's things like that too that can kind of help with the costs. But also, what a lot of election officials are doing is they're putting them outside of existing government facilities or transit hubs or places that already have that camera equipment in place. Sorry, my mom's here and she's cooking, so she just dropped the pan. Sorry about that. But there's a lot of existing government structures that already have a lot of the significant camera infrastructure in place. Grocery stores tend to have that outside of their stores, so election offices will utilize that feed and they don't have to set up their own. And then the ballot security aspect, so ensuring that there's a bipartisan team that's emptying and there's very set, clear procedures about the chain of custody of the transport of those. Orange County has a GIS tracking system that they use. So the ballots literally are tracked electronically when they're moving, and they can see all of the routes and they can see where everything is coming in from on their dashboard. So I think those sorts of things are going to continue to improve over time and spread further as election officials share these sorts of good practices that they're utilizing.
So staying on voting administration, this is probably an easy one, but I do want to raise this topic. One of the things that we were obviously highly critical of in the National Academies report was paperless voting systems, electronic paperless voting systems, and said pretty emphatically they should be eliminated, removed, etc. And this election, more Americans were using voter verifiable paper ballots, whether directly or through some electronic system and so on, than any previous election and so on. I'm assuming that all of you are supportive of the need to continue to remove paperless electronic voting systems, and see this as obviously a definite sort of vulnerability. Anybody got any comments on that? It's hard to, I realize in spite of the fact it seems obvious, there are those who will still try and make the case for them, but anybody want to comment on that topic?
I changed my terminology a couple of years ago. I don't refer to these things, any of the current ballot marking devices or the previous DREs as voting machines, because I think a machine is something people expect to work. I call them voting computers because I think that adds the appropriate skepticism about whether they're going to do what they're supposed to do. You can't audit, and we used paperless computers statewide in South Carolina until fall of 2019. And I audited the data. There were bugs that I found in 2010 that were still there in 2019. It's just very complicated. And the paper is the only thing you have, I mean, to be able to audit. we had voting computers in South Carolina that would throw error messages saying, my memory chips are bad. What do you do with the votes in that computer? Do you count them thinking they're okay? Do you not count them and disenfranchise the voters that happen to do that? We have to get rid of the paperless machines.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, please, Bridgett. Yeah.
No, I was just going to add one thing. So during the 2020 election and during the runoff in Georgia, I had the opportunity to, sit myself in some polling locations over a couple of days and sort of just watch voters and poll workers interact. And so, in the environment that the 2020 election occurred and the Georgia runoff, there was a lot of misinformation. Also, voters expressed concern about sort of what happens to their ballots once they leave the polling location. And if we think about sort of how we communicate trust in a system and process, reminding that poll workers are the people on the ground, it is easier, shall I say, to explain to a voter what happens to their ballot when it goes into an optical scanner, particularly if like in LA County where you can actually see the ballot drop in, as opposed to trying to perhaps have a poll worker explain a highly sophisticated digital process that involves a series of algorithms to, I don't even know science, right? To transition what they input on the system to the actual outcome of the election. That was my comment.
All right, let's move to cybersecurity. I guess let me just start with just a broad question. Based on the experience of this election, which of course, as people know, Mr. Krebs said was, I think, the safest, the most secure, words to that effect ever. But based on the experience and based on how much work the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency did to help do that, what are the outstanding issues that still need to be addressed in terms of the cybersecurity of the election infrastructure more broadly? Obviously, progress has been made there, but there's clearly going to be more to do. People want to comment on what else needs to be really addressed. What should the priorities be?
I would argue that one of the major priorities is that if we're going to move toward more voting by mail, we need to make absolutely sure that the voter registration database that is the real database is not the one that's online. Because as Robert Mueller said, there are only two kinds of computers on the internet, those that have been hacked and those that have not yet been hacked. There are ways to maintain a pristine voter registration database offline almost all the time. Use that for configuring ballot styles and not have the one that voters see online be the real database, because that's a real problem. If you corrupt that, you lose.
Maggie, from your point of view in New Mexico, what do you put top of the list in terms of cybersecurity issues?
Yeah, well, I agree with Duncan. I mean, we have to keep our systems as air-gapped as possible and as secure as possible. And as one of the little known co-authors of that same statement that is often attributed to Chris Krebs, however, he's received a lot more heat for it than I have personally over the last year. I agree with the statement that this was the most secure from certainly a cybersecurity perspective, as well as many other perspectives, election in our nation's history. But what I would just say is, I can't point to one thing that we need to be doing better, but I will say from just the general perspective of the cybersecurity community, and I've been sitting on the Government Coordinating Council with DHS regarding election infrastructure since its inception. So this is a thread that has flown through, ever since elections became critical infrastructure and will continue first and foremost, we have to continue to make this an absolute priority because, as my colleague Steve Simon in Minnesota says, cybersecurity is a marathon without a finish line. Because every way that we figure out how to secure our systems, those who want to hack them or tamper with them are going to figure out new ways to try to do that. So keeping this a top priority of the federal government, of state governments, working with Congress to make sure that we continue to have their attention on this issue, to have federal funding at the state and local levels for this work is really critical, because it's nice that we've received some big pots of money from the federal government to really, when we're talking about combating cyber terrorism, we're talking about fighting against nation states, right? I'm not equipped in New Mexico to do that just by myself, right? We need the partnership of all of the national federal infrastructure and that funding as well. But I think the next step that we all acknowledge that we have to go to across the country is to make more inroads at the local level, because as we've all said today multiple times in multiple ways, the local level, the counties and the municipalities are where the elections are run on the ground. And so I can have all the bells and whistles on my state system, but if I've got, a local county clerk that's still, running on an old version of Windows that's hugely vulnerable, or, if they just don't have the resources to move their election website to a .gov environment, right? These are the things that we need to address, the very basic bare minimum things. And that's where I think we still have the most work to do in general, is to make sure our local entities are secure.
And we also, as something that Secretary Oliver sort of said, we also need to realize that cybersecurity is always and only a defensive game. You don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what vulnerabilities you have until it's too late.
All right.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, I think that as we also see more and more states moving to automatic voter registration, automatic address updates, more data sharing techniques to improve government systems overall, that's happening across the country. It's not just voter registration, but it's all of these. And so, the more kind of transferring of data and in and out that we have, that also has to be considered as part of this. And so it's kind of, it goes beyond even the Secretary of State's office or the local officials in many ways, because there is so much, there's more connectivity now than there used to be. And so we have to be very thoughtful about, the policy aspect of that, and then how it's implemented. And then a big one, continuous improvement. Like, we should never, anything in the election process, whether it's cybersecurity or anything else, continuous improvement is key to continue to make sure that the systems are effective for voters, secure, transparent, all those things. And there's never a perfect, we can always do better. That's kind of been my perspective all along. We can, can get to a really good point, can always do something better. There's always ways to improve. And so I just think we have to be in that mindset of continuous improvement on all these things, including and especially with regards to cybersecurity, to do our best to get in front of things, but then be ready to be defensive and make sure the system's resilient.
Bridgett, anything you'd like to add at all?
No.
Okay, so let me move on to audits, and let me in particular address this to Amber to start with. Obviously, audits have received attention I guess they probably never received before this election, and one started to see fairly competent discussions of what was actually involved in auditing elections start to appear in the press, and great interest was taken in them, and there was commentators on it night after night after night. And I remember when we were doing the report, preparing the report, the National Academies report, we visited Colorado and Denver in particular, saw what was being done to implement risk limiting audits there. It was extremely impressive what you had done. I think at that stage you were one of, I think, only 2 or 3 other states that had implemented RLAs. I know there's other types of auditing available as well. What would you like to? What could you say about the importance of that? experience that you had, and what other states can learn from what you did and what is being done in Colorado.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, risk limiting audits and advanced auditing techniques that they bring are absolutely critical to ensuring that election security is to the standard that it needs to be in the election process. And then there's multiple other points in the process where there's auditing or testing happening that don't get as much attention, but are equally as important as that kind of final process. And so the steps to test and validate the equipment and the setup and all of that prior to the election is absolutely critical. The auditing of the mail ballot files. So we just talked about, the voter registration database and the importance of that data being accurate, just like it is for the poll books on election day. The data has to be exactly right on the envelopes, and we have to make sure that voters are getting every piece of data and every ballot card if they're getting multiple. So there's a whole process with regards to the production of a mail ballot and that going out the door that also needs an audit, a good audit on the front end process. And then the post-election audits, like you mentioned, I mean, this is absolutely essential. And I also think that there's more opportunity to continue to build systems that assist with the RLA process. I was actually involved in 3 state presidential primaries in Kansas, Wyoming, and Alaska that were ranked choice voting and vote by mail for all 3 last spring. And we contracted with Jennifer Morell to help conduct a risk limiting audit on all 3 of those states' elections, did statewide risk limiting audits on ranked choice voting with vote by mail. With neither one of us, Jennifer or I, never actually stepped foot in any of those states. We had to do it all remotely, run the election, and then do the audit. But it was pretty incredible. An RLA was done on Zoom. We recorded it, and so there's a real possibility to do this effectively, infuse transparency, share what, that kind of the power of sharing that audit across the airways and people across the country being able to see and participate in it is significant. And that's a significant step forward. And it was really driven by a pandemic, right? So we had to iterate, we had to innovate, and we're able to get that done. And so I just can't say enough about the importance of that work and continuing to expand it.
Maggie, what in New Mexico, how are you utilizing audits? Obviously, you're using them in some form. Are you using full risk limiting audits, at least in part, in some parts of your elections?
We do employ a risk-based audit. We don't go down to the single ballot level. We actually have a formula that's set forth in statute. So if you have at different levels of the election, based on the outcome of the election, you will audit more or fewer ballots, depending on how big the margin of victory was. And so that is a fundamentally risk limiting practice. We've been doing that in New Mexico since 2008. It has worked really well. It's been very successful. We have found in every election, and we've audited 2 different types of voting systems over the years, that every election our ballots have been counted accurately. But I'll say 2 quick things. First of all, Amber's exactly right. That back end process is really critical, but also that front end process, the logic and accuracy testing, and the transparency of all of that to make sure what you're sending out into the field is counting accurately is really incredibly important too, right? And in almost every location that I can think of, that's a public process, right? Folks can come in and observe that happening before a machine even gets delivered to a polling location to know that that machine is counting accurately. But I think we need to do a better job talking to the public about what post-election audits are, how they work, what they're looking for, what the confidence levels mean, because, what I'm really concerned is, I'm looking at what's going on in Arizona right now, this sort of completely super legal process that's just happening. While we have the paper ballots, that's good. The paper ballots can be looked at, that's good. But is it following auditing best practices? Is it transparent? They don't have the benefit of election administrator experience and knowledge to make sure that things are being done correctly. So I think if more folks knew about what they had already done in Arizona to ensure the accuracy that those ballots were counted correctly, right? That maybe we wouldn't be in a situation like this. So I get a little bit fearful for the future of this sort of, what would you call it? Just, I don't know, whatever the word for it is, but just, folks coming in and just conducting audits all over the place too, right? If it's not done properly, that's a problem. So we need to do a better job of that, of, advertising, if you will, to the public. This is what we do. This is what we already do. And it's in this very transparent, nonpartisan process. So you can have greater confidence.
Any other comments on this topic? I'm going to just ask one last question, and then we're going to go to the questions from the audience. Nothing else? Let me say, I think that I'd be interested in your comments on this. In the last election, some of the real heroes of the last election were the election officials in hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands in multiple states who did their job, and sometimes did it under extreme pressure in a nonpartisan way to try to ensure the most accurate possible result of their particular election. But the whole process of being an election official, what you have to do is, I think, just seems to be getting more and more sort of complicated. The demands being put on people are getting more, the pressure is getting stronger, and what have you. This then raises the whole question of more professionalization, more training, and so on of election officials. What are your thoughts about the best way to go about training election officials to enable them to be able to handle the complexities and pressures of this absolutely fundamental job, fundamental to democracy, this extraordinarily important job? Comments from anybody?
Well,
Amber,
go ahead, Maggie.
oh, go ahead. No, sorry.
No, go ahead.
None of us is comfortable with an awkward silence, I guess, so. Which is okay. I was just going to say, I think Amber nailed it on the head earlier when she was talking about the need for professionalism, or the professionalization, if you will, of election administration. This is a very complicated and complex job. I had no idea at the age of 30, when I became a county clerk in a large metropolitan area, that I was going to soon become an informal IT project manager. That was, not something that I had any previous experience with, right? And thankfully my brain tends to work that way. But the challenge is that I think most folks think probably if they have you walk into the polling place, you have a good experience there. Oh, this election stuff, this is easy. If things get messed up, you must be a real incompetent, or, you must really not have your stuff together. Elections are hugely complex. I mean, I think Duncan said it best when he said chaos, right? I mean, they're organized chaos. So many different little things, from state laws and administrative rules to logistics to all of the individual humans that come into play, the training that needs to happen, the equipment. I mean, it's phenomenal. So I think we need to continue to invest in election administration. And part of that is, making election administration a profession that folks aspire to. Right now, if I were looking at starting a career in election administration, I'd be pretty turned off, because look at how badly our election administrators get treated around this country, and how badly they have been treated, right? So we really need to elevate, support, both financially and emotionally, right? The folks in the trenches doing this important work, and really recruit the best and brightest to come help sustain our democracy into the future.
Yeah, very well said. Well, on that eloquent note, let me hand over to Steve, who is going to ask you questions that the audience has submitted. So Steve, over to you.
So one attendee in the chat mentioned that they're speaking with a federal policymaker about the meaning of caste as it's used in the law. So how can legislators become aware of the importance of election syntax like caste and ballot to the extent that courts will interpret the laws as they're originally intended? It seems to point to Bridget's earlier point about election practitioners being vital to the policy writing process.
If I could comment on that, in South Carolina, we used a ballot marking device that printed English text, but that was not what was used to tabulate votes. What was used to tabulate votes was a barcode. And I had a question of the legislators: what is the official ballot? If the official ballot is the barcode, we're actually almost lying to the voters in telling them to look at the text. And if the text is the official ballot, then we're counting official results from unofficial barcodes. We need to have a good understanding of what the terms mean. What is a cast vote? There's also a discussion in a number of states about whether when the ballot images are, when the ballots are scanned by the scanners, is there a file of those scanned images produced, and does that constitute ballot data that has to be kept under federal law for 22 months? I would argue it is. It is election data. It needs to be kept for 22 months, and it should be publicly available in states where it's publicly available. I think there is a terminology question, and unfortunately we have 50 states and a couple of other places, so we're going to have different laws across different states too.
Great. So I have another question. So given 31 states allow for a subset of population to use email and fax to return a marked ballot, should we consider design, best practices, and piloting of online voting solutions?
No. Emphatically, no.
For the sake of the audience, Duncan, would you like to elaborate just a little?
The internet is not a secure place. Voters at home with old computers, I mean, if there are election officials with old Windows unpatched computers, surely there are voters with old unpatched Windows computers. How do you authenticate a voter? Do you use two-party authentication practices? And the other thing to think about is that voting is a right and not a privilege. And we should not be privileging the voters that happen to have good computer access and taking that privilege away from others. The internet is not secure. Every time anybody has looked at any of these online systems, they have found flaws and bugs and problems, partly because the software goes through many, many, many layers, not all of which were written by the vendor of the voting software, and you're trusting a whole bunch of other people to have gotten it right. And it's the handoff from one layer of software to another that generally has the problem. My father told me this a long time ago. In any technology thing, it's the interaction between human brains that's the problem, not what goes on inside one human brain.
Thanks, Duncan. So another question. So election officials often speak about the need for consistent, sustained funding to conduct their work. However, policymakers at both the state and federal level often resort to sporadic infusions of resources for election security. So specifically, how does this harm our election preparation?
Well, since I was on my soapbox about this earlier, I'll just, I'll get back on it for a minute. Another analogy that I like to use a lot is that elections are, and the planning and preparation for elections are like changing the tire on the car while the car is in motion. We don't really have downtime. You know, that time between elections is our planning and preparation time. And because elections are so complex and require so much planning for successful implementation, it's really hard for us to use funding at the last minute. There's a need to build up institutional knowledge and to bring in technology to train, to make sure that it's working correctly, right? The last thing that you want to do is start implementing a new policy or procedure with new folks who don't know what they're doing, or with new technology that you don't know if it's going to work right. And the need for sustained funding is to be able to do that, to be able to know, okay, we're going to be able to fund these positions. We're going to be able to bring folks in. We're going to have time to train them and get them used to what they're doing and become, experts, by the time election time rolls around. And then that we're not going to lose them after that election, right? And have to kind of go through the whole process over again. So the harm is that if you want elections that are run smoothly and without problems and that are secure and have accessibility, they need to be funded that way in order to make sure that happens.
And I would just add, I think everything that Secretary Oliver just said, but beyond that too, elections, a lot of people are kind of like, oh, they now take a break for a couple years or what have you till the next election comes around. And you think about right now, even just the schedule, a lot of elections have already happened this year. They're continuing to happen. There's more in November. And then the election officials are going to get redistricting information from reapportionment commissions and legislative, and they're going to turn all of that around basically within a few weeks to re-precinct the entire country. That's all going to happen now in December to January. And then, a lot of states have legislative cycles that start January 1st or around that time. And when we think about election officials not being included in legislation and having to try to keep up and try to get their voices inserted, while lots of lobbyists are paying lots of money to get their interests met with legislative bodies, election officials are often sidelined and election officials are not listened to in that process. And then they're running an election again. So it's a continuous thing. And Secretary Oliver is exactly right. Chronic underinvestment in this has perpetuated this problem over and over and over, whether it be technology or investment, voter registration systems, whatever it might be. And it's chronic and it's happened for decades. And so not only do we need to figure out a way to continually invest, but we have to catch up. So there's a big catch-up process that also requires this. And this sort of one-time allocation of funding from Congress occasionally when there's a crisis or a big issue or what have you is not going to cut it. So it is going to need to be a systematic approach, a real thoughtful process about what does federal investment look like, what is state investment, how do we fund these things, and probably significant creativity. I actually, a couple of years ago, and I'm just going to quickly say this, I was giving a speech and someone asked me about how could you, what do you recommend for getting more funds into the election process? And I said, honestly, if your state hasn't legalized marijuana yet, you should try to get a cut of the profits because there's ways to also think about this in a creative way. This is investment in the infrastructure that supports our democracy. And so we've got to figure out a continuous way to fund it.
Thank you. So another question from one of our attendees. So as elections move increasingly to paper and absentee ballots, are there ways that we can do additional kind of security on these paper ballots, the way that we use for checks and paper money now? So they mentioned watermarks, heat sensitive icons, other abilities to detect alterations or features that we see in other kind of paper products. Are these things that we could see in paper ballots moving forward?
Yeah, and it's starting. Actually, one of the vendors has actually worked on some enhancements for this for a while because they have focused mostly on their attention on paper ballots and the processing of them. So they've got various renditions of security paper and recommendations on that. And what we want to make sure, though, is that it's not, it is going to be a security feature. So, what gets released about what that looks like and those sorts of things is a whole nother part of the conversation. And then want to make sure it's not cost prohibitive because, again, elections are not invested in appropriately. So need to make sure that those things, but yes, those conversations are continuing, and there's, at least one vendor that has actually invested in more thought and innovation around this issue. And I think that will continue to be another thing that we see as an enhancement.
Okay, another question. So what are some recommended key policy standards that we could see in the near future that we could see these election officials implementing that you would recommend maybe specifically that they could do in the near future?
All right, I'll jump in on the awkward silence. So I think the obvious one that we saw play out in 2020 is pre-processing. There's no reason to wait till election day to process vote by mail ballots or any early voting ballots, paper ballots, there is a reason to do that. You can save and conserve on equipment. You can identify potential issues. If there's anything that isn't working right on a piece of equipment, you can identify that in advance. So there's a resiliency component to that. And, you know, Pennsylvania, Michigan, New York, those states, Wisconsin, waited till election day. And of course, exactly what all of us said would happen. And then people saw this happening in the news. They were told one thing, the truth was another. So that's a really obvious one. I think improving the request process for vote by mail is another one. A lot of states still don't allow it online. You know, so improving those systems will help election officials downstream. Drop boxes, ballot tracking, those are all things that are definitely being discussed in terms of that specific thing. And lots of modernization around voter registration. I think that's going to continue to be a focus area.
Okay, I think this might be our last question. So one of our attendees suggests that we're seeing misinformation come from elected officials in some cases. So in light of a lot of, many state legislatures using these concerns about widespread election fraud as justification for restricting voting, how do you combat misinformation coming from elected officials versus kind of other sources in the election ecosystem?
Yeah, election officials are not perfect. And as we talked about earlier in the conversation, the vast majority of them leave their political hats behind when they come to the office. But a lot of them, I mean, it's in my opinion, the greatest challenge, particularly for those of us at the state level, secretaries of state. I mean, we're expected to be standard bearers for our parties, those of us who are elected, right? And, it's often and sometimes an awkward situation for those of us who have to, I'll say hypothetically, like feel like you have to toe the party line, right? But then at the same time, make sure you're conducting your work in a fair and accountable way. I think that it's unfortunate when election officials feel like they have to allow politics into the realm of election administration. It's just hugely problematic. But I think like with any other elected position, I mean, what it comes down to is accountability. And there are a lot of things that we can do as citizens to hold our elected officials accountable. Of course, the main one is how we decide to, hire them or fire them on election day, right? But there's a lot of other work that we can do. There is a growing movement to move for some ethical reform along the lines of election officials, in terms of sort of, swearing oaths and things like this to conduct their work in a nonpartisan manner. But I will tell you, we're really starting to have these conversations at the national level about how can we be more nonpartisan in our work and work more closely together in a bipartisan way as well, right? And talk, come together to talk about, okay, what do we agree on and how can we build on that? Right. So it's a challenge for sure. I'm not going to lie.
Anybody else got anything to finish up with?
Well, I was just going to add one more thing on that. I think you had also asked kind of about how to inform elected officials that are maybe saying the wrong thing about the election process. And I just want to highlight, I mean, this is something we did a little bit of in 2020. It was hard to do in the pandemic, but we did before. Michael, you mentioned to me that you had traveled to Denver. I am convinced that proximity trips to visit good practices, best practices, not only for election officials, but for policymakers is absolutely critical. And I just took a couple of lawmakers out to see Orange County's election in California in March. And I won't say kind of what states, but there were a few different states that we've mentioned today. And all of them were shocked to see how Orange County, California runs their election process with vote by mail compared to what's happening in their states. And they all said to me, and these are all policymakers, I didn't realize it could be like that. And then now they are more educated on what it could look like, what visually the policies and procedures that we're talking about look like. And I think that there were minds and perspectives changed. So I think one of the ways that we can kind of combat disinformation, inaccurate information, is this further education of not only election officials, because it's good to share practices, but really policymakers and influencers on these conversations, because a lot of people have never stepped foot in election office, and it's a completely different world for them. And so I think the more we can do to educate with these sorts of very specific examples of actions, the better off we can make the overall election structure.
Of course,
That's an
the chief election official in Orange County was on our committee, I think, as you know, too. So, look, with that, I think we're right at time, just a minute over time. So let me thank very much Secretary Oliver, Ms. McReynolds, Professors Buell and King for your contributions today on this immensely important topic to our democracy, and hopefully one that much can be learned that will improve the elections in the future, and we'll gain and learn from this as opposed to going backwards. That certainly is what we hoped, and certainly I think we heard today about some of the ways that we can move things forward too. So my most sincere thanks on behalf of the AAAS and the National Academies for your contributions and your involvement today. So thank you very much, and thanks to our audience too, and we may do this again at some other time. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Okay, thanks all.